Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awakening people. I've done over 375 of them now, and if you have not seen these before, go to batgap.com and look under the past interviews menu, and you'll find them all organized in about 5 different ways. This show is made possible by the support of appreciative listeners and viewers, and so if you appreciate it and feel like supporting it, there's a PayPal link on every page of the site. My guest today is Regina Dawn Akers, and I've kind of known Regina for quite a few years now, probably 5 or 6 years. We've been peripherally in touch, but I've never really spoken to her directly, and I've had like a couple of her books on in my iTunes collection to listen to, but I've never gotten around to listen to them until the last week, and I started doing so and really enjoyed them. So I'm going to start by just reading the bio that Regina sent me, and then we'll get into it in much more detail. Regina has been sharing spiritual teachings, organizing retreats, and leading pilgrimages to holy sites in Israel and India since 2005. She's published 2 books, The Holy Spirit's Interpretation of the New Testament, NTI for short, and The Teachings of Inner Ramana. Her 3rd book, Thoughts of Awakening, 365 Thoughts for Daily Contemplation, is provided as a free ebook. Each of these books came to Regina from within through her willingness to be their scribe, student, and teacher. She is a living model of their teachings and a clear channel of the deeper meaning that lies hidden beyond the written word. Regina shares insightful and consistent clarity using a variety of spiritual teachings as pointers. She is the founder of Awakening Together, a worldwide online spiritual assembly dedicated to helping people become self-reliant with inner spiritual wisdom. Awakening Together uses the teachings of many spiritual traditions to point toward one truth, one true self, which lies peacefully within each of us. Regina is the author of Awakening Together's 2-year minister preparation program, which is a contemplative study of truth through teachings from Hinduism, Buddhism, Sufism, Kabbalah, and the Tao Te Ching, A Course in Miracles, and the New Testament, and contemporary masters including Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj. When she is not traveling, Regina lives a quiet life in Pueblo, Colorado. She enjoys spending time with her family, her dog, and a few close friends. Many of Regina's teachings are available freely online at reginadawnakers.com. She also invites everyone to enjoy the inspiration and online spiritual community provided through awakening-together.org. So, welcome, Regina.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. I read that whole thing, even though people could read it on the website, because some people just listen to this as an audio, and they may not have even looked at the website, and so it gives them an overview of who you are.
Thank you.
So I've listened to a couple of interviews with you, and I've heard your story of how you stumbled into all this, but no one else has probably who's listening to this. So let's go through it chronologically. I mean, you have an interesting story, and I think a lot of information will come out as you recount it.
All right.
Okay, so you grew up in a rather conservative Christian family, was it?
Well,
or maybe a disinterested Christian family. And
yeah,
you started.
Christian.
Yeah, you started going to church, right?
Yeah, it was a Christian culture. I was raised in Kansas.
Okay.
So I don't know. I think Kansas is just about as
it's the buckle of the Bible Belt.
Yeah. Yeah. It's as Midwestern as you get. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I guess the story starts when I was around 11. I don't remember exactly what age, but I think 11. And for some reason, I wanted to get to know God. Mm-hmm. And so the only way that I could do it that I knew of at the time was just to walk to the nearest church, which was about 2 blocks away. And I started attending. It was a Southern Baptist church. And at first, I really liked it. I was saved and I was baptized, and that felt really good. And then it wore off, and so I got saved and baptized again. And I got in trouble. I was told I couldn't do this a 3rd time. But at some point, I was around 13, and I was in 7th grade, and we were having our first school dance, and I wanted to go to this school dance. and the preacher told me that it was a sin to dance. And I asked him to show me that in the Bible, and I've always been very sincere, and so at that time I thought the Bible was the Word of God. So if he had been able to show me that it was a sin, I wouldn't have gone to the dance, but he couldn't show me. And so even as a young kid, I thought, this guy's just making stuff up, and I left. So my next religious experience was my parents got a divorce, and my father remarried a woman, and shortly after they got remarried, she became one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I think just out of a desire to be part of the family, I started going to the Kingdom Hall and studying with Jehovah's Witnesses. But based on my experience with this Baptist preacher, I really liked them for two reasons. One, they could show me everything in the Bible that they said. And two, they didn't believe in a hell, which was a step up, I thought.
Did they believe in dancing?
Yeah, it was okay to dance.
Okay.
Yeah. No holidays, but you could dance.
Dance every day.
Yeah. But at some point, I think when I was around 15 or 16, first I got to tell you a little bit about my dad. My dad is this really good guy. In fact, if you think of Andy Taylor, Sheriff Andy Taylor, do you remember him?
From the Andy Griffith Show?
Yeah. That's my dad, except he was a JCPenney manager. But he's just this really good guy.
And
but
you were Opie, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. But he never took to being one of Jehovah's Witnesses, even though his wife and his 4 stepdaughters did, and I did. He never took to it. Mm-hmm. And the Witnesses, even though they don't believe in hell, they do believe in Armageddon. And they believe that, I guess Jesus is going to return, and God is going to really severely punish all of the unbelievers being people that aren't Jehovah's Witnesses. And I remember reading things like the birds plucking the eyeballs out of the people, and just this horrible stuff. And I thought, I looked at my dad, who's just this really good guy, and I thought, I'm more loving than that. I would not do that to him just because he doesn't believe something. And God has got to be more loving than me. So that caused me to walk away from that spirituality as well.
There's 2 interesting points here which we could talk about for a minute. Okay. One is believing stuff. It's like, I've thought about this in various ways over the years, but the best way I can look at it now is everything is a working hypothesis. Everything is something you can investigate, and maybe some hypotheses are more credible than others. Like, it's probably more likely that the moon is made of rock than it's made of green cheese. But if somebody wants to say it's made of green cheese, fine, let's investigate that, So that's point number 1. And point number 2 is this, what I regard as a sort of a fear-based, egotistical thing about thinking that my way is the only way, or my way is the best way. And it's like this insecurity, actually, that reveals itself in that attitude. Anyway, why don't you comment on both of those things?
Well, you sound like me, Rick. I mean, yeah. I don't know if you've listened to any of my teachings, but you sound... Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. I feel that, first of all, believing is a huge block to realizing what's true. And that in order to realize what's true, first we have to uncover and remove our beliefs. And I don't know if I sent you recently a very recent teaching of mine where, I'm going even deeper and deeper and deeper into that, letting go of everything that I believe, because I really just feel beliefs are the obstacle. So I am letting go of everything, and I am just being present with what is being. I have a very, very strong intuition, and so I have something that I can pay attention to, so I don't feel like I'm hanging out there with nothing, but I'm leaving the thinking mind behind and all of its beliefs and all of its opinions. And and then as far as there's only one way, Awakening Together is all about the fact, if we look at just the planet Earth, for example, and don't imagine any planets other than this with people on it, because we don't know that for sure, at least I don't. So if we look at just the planet Earth with 7.5 billion souls, I feel there's probably 7.5 billion different awakenings then.
Yeah.
There's not any 2 that are exactly alike. There are certainly things that we can glean from each other and learn from each other and point. But there's no such thing as one way. And I do feel a lot of teachers make a mistake in that they think that their way is the way. And that's just a little error, I think.
Yeah. I've been reading a book called Reason and Wonder by a guy named Dave Pruitt, and he's sort of, at this point in the book, he's tracing the history of the tussle between science and religion over the position of the Earth relative to the other planets and the sun and so on. And it was, they burned people at the stake for believing that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and that there might actually be other planets in the universe that other beings live on, because this was seen as such a threat to the primacy of the church and the primacy of human life and so on. And I mean, it's sort of actually, I haven't talked to one recently, but whenever I've been confronted by fundamentalists, I tend to start talking astronomy with them. It shuts them up pretty quick.
I'm not capable of doing that. So.
Well, you just start giving them a sense of the size of the universe and the probability of the universe being teeming with life, and the speed of light and how huge it is and how ancient it is and so on. It's a good way of expanding people's perspectives, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the reason people like to think that my way is the way is, again, that holds on to me. I mean, there has to be a me to have a my way. So It's just another defense mechanism.
Yeah. And it's also, this attitude that, well, my way is the best way because I'm doing it. If there was something better, I'd be doing that. But obviously I'm doing this, so it must be the best.
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess we've beaten that point to death.
Back to the story, you think?
Yeah. Go ahead. Back to the story.
Back to the story? All right. So the next step in the story is a long ways away. I took time off to party and travel around the world and start a career and lots of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think the next step is probably when I was around 28 years old. And I don't even know why this happened, but all of a sudden I just had this burning desire to know what the truth is. But at that time, I still had a belief that the Bible was the Word of God, and I thought that the truth would be the correct interpretation of the Bible. So I bought this lovely book called Religions in America. And what's great about it is it goes to the leaders of each of the respective churches, and it interviews them about their beliefs. So you're getting it right from the horse's mouth. And I also got like 7 different translations of the Bible, because, if you look at different translations, they aren't the same either. And I started this huge research project where I was studying every major religion in America, every major Christian religion, I should say, every denomination, to find the right one. And the only thing that study did was show me that at some point, in order to uphold their beliefs, somebody had to ignore something in the Bible, or they had to twist something, in all sorts of different ways. And it just kind of left me with none of them are the truth. And I don't remember if I felt like that was a failure or not. I think I might have, because I think I gave up the search for a while. But now that I look back on it, that was a huge step forward, because I had to remove that obstacle that the Bible was the Word of God and it's the truth, and and that whole thing. And that's, of course, what happened.
And if you got into a little biblical history, reading Elaine Pagels and all that stuff, you probably realize that what we now have as the Bible is really a hodgepodge, that was collected together and edited every which way over the years. And who knows what, if you took all the original texts and even the non-text, because a lot of stuff wasn't even written down for a couple of hundred years. But if you could have been there as a scribe and gotten it all, who knows what we'd have compared to what we have.
Yeah, that would be fun to be the scribe of the Bible.
Yeah.
Of course, in a way, I got my own chance at that, and we'll talk about that.
Right. All right.
So I think the next step was probably a few years after that. I saw Marianne Williamson on Oprah.
Whom I'm going to interview in about a month. Yeah.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, she was talking about her book, A Return to Love. I think this was around the time that book had come out. Mm-hmm. And, you know how you get that inner feeling that, oh, there's something here. So that's what I got. And so I bought that book, and I read that book a couple of times and just ate it up. And then I wanted to go to the source material. She was talking about another book called A Course in Miracles, and I considered that the source material. So I went to that, and I gave that a try, but it didn't really take. First of all, I couldn't understand the words very well. Even though they were English words, it was Greek to me. And there's a workbook for people who don't know with the course with 365 lessons in it. And I started the workbook, and at first it's pretty easy. You do something for a minute in the morning and a minute in the evening. But at some point, the course is asking you to remember something every hour or every half hour or even every 15 minutes. And my feeling was, and Jesus is the supposed author of the course. So my feeling was, doesn't Jesus know I have a job?
They probably have apps for that now, that pop up on your phone every 15 minutes.
So I quit. I quit. But another book came to me around that same time when I was trying to understand the course, and that's a much simpler book. It's called Peace Pilgrim.
Oh yeah.
Her life and works in her own words.
That's a great book.
Yeah, it's a great book, and she's a very genuine person. At least that's how it hit me. That was my perception. Very genuine. So I trusted her. Mm-hmm. And she spoke about this thing called oneness, which was very alien to my experience, as you know. I mean, you know how we experience. This is me, and that's you, and all of that. But because I trusted her, instead of just closing my mind to it, there was like this open curiosity that was something like, how could that be? How could it be that we're one? And I was walking into work one day, and this was my first mystical experience. I had this vision, and it was a vision of an infinite light. But the light, one portion of the light was covered with, can you see my hand?
Yes.
Yeah. One portion of the light was covered with these black polka dots. And, they were all just right next to each other like this. And so where the black polka dots were, the light was blocked. You couldn't see the light. But some of those black polka dots were beginning to fade. And the ones that were beginning to fade, you could see some light shining through them. Mm-hmm. And then there were also some spaces where the polka dots had completely faded out, and you could see the light completely. And even though I didn't have any of the words then to put to that, I understood intuitively that the black polka dots represented the individual self or the belief in the person. And I knew that when that faded, whatever that was, that when that faded, that the true self shined through, and it was at the level of the true self that we were really one. Mm-hmm. So I understood that. But then again, the next step doesn't come for like 7 or 9 years, because what I did was I adopted my daughter from China. I started getting promoted at work. So again, I became very, very busy. And I had set lots of interesting goals for myself when I was really young, around 19, primarily because I thought that I was the scum of the earth, the most unworthy soul here. Huh. And I thought that if I achieve all this stuff, then I'll be as good as you guys. Right? So that was my method of becoming as good as you. And when I was around 44, I'd done it all. You could say I was sitting on top of my own little hill. And it wasn't that I noticed myself as unhappy, or some people really perceive themselves as having suffered a lot. I didn't perceive myself that way. But there was just kind of this, now what? Now what? And when I started asking now what, I remembered that blue book, A Course in Miracles, that I had stuck in a drawer many years ago. And the feeling was to pull that out and begin reading that again. And the course is divided in 3 sections. There's a text, which is quite large. The workbook for students, which, as I mentioned, is 365 lessons. And then there's this little bitty manual for teachers in the back. And so I didn't want to make this huge commitment, so I just start with the manual for teachers. And what was really interesting was, first of all, it wasn't Greek anymore. Something had shifted in my mind in that 7 to 9 year period, where now it was like reading a novel. I understood it easily as I read it. And 2, it felt like it was speaking directly to me. Now, at that point, I never had any idea at all that I would ever be a spiritual teacher. So when I say it was speaking directly to me, I don't mean that I thought it was asking me to be a spiritual teacher. I thought that it was asking me to be a teacher through beingness. through embracing this and living this in my normal everyday life 24 hours a day. That's what I thought it was asking me to do. And so I agreed. And we were going on a vacation soon, and I did have a very busy life, so I thought it would be easier to start it on vacation when things are a little slower. So I took the course with me. We went on a Disney cruise. My daughter was, I think, 6 at the time. And I got up the first morning on the cruise, and I was going to start the workbook and start the text. And, you know, just because I was starting something holy, you know, a new holy commitment, I thought that I would say a prayer. And I don't really remember what I was praying, but during the prayer, it's literally like something came down over me. It kind of reminds me of literally a Moses burning bush type of moment, even though I didn't see a burning bush. But, you know, something came down over me, and I was just overcome with this desire to surrender the rest of my life. And I said, I will learn whatever you want me to learn. I will do whatever you want me to do. Just make me useful for the rest of my life.
I love that.
Yeah, and what I didn't fully realize then was my whole life changed in that moment. First of all, again, I was reading the course now and doing the workbook lessons, and it was easy. And you know, I hear a lot of people who have done a Course in Miracles workbook say, you know they didn't do it right. They only did so many lessons. They would, if it said remember something every hour, they wouldn't, and, you know, all of that. I did. You know, that's a miracle. I mean, something was causing me to remember. And I had a full-time job. I was a director of a department in a national company. I went to back-to-back meetings, and none of that got in my way. And I can't explain it. It's just the way it was. After about 2 months, or maybe more than 2, from April to July, so in early July, one morning I was reading a lesson. I think it was around lesson 77 or so. The name of the lesson is I Am Entitled to Miracles. And I was reading that lesson, and something in that lesson caused me to see how unworthy I thought I was. And also to realize that if I held on to that I would never experience what at that time I would have called the Holy Spirit. I would never experience, let's put it this way, something beyond me, the person. So I made a very firm decision in that moment that I had to let that go. I had to believe I was entitled to miracles, and I had to do it right now. And I closed my eyes, and the instant I closed my eyes, this would have been my second vision now, but the first one had been many years before. And I saw myself as a little girl. I was standing in a room that was very lit up. It had no furniture or anything, but the door was open. You know, so like here's the wall, and here's the door, and there's this crack in between. And see how that crack is shadowed?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I was standing in that shadow, and I thought I was in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I saw in the vision was that I thought I was in the dark, but actually there was light everywhere, and I only just had to come out just a little bit. And then this hand came in and lingered, and like I knew that all I had to do is grab a hold of that finger, and it would actually pull me out. Mm-hmm. So that was my first vision in many years. My first vision with the Course. Later that day, my boyfriend was driving my daughter and me to the airport. We were going to Myrtle Beach for the 4th of July. And I had an experience. I don't quite know what it was. You might. It was an energy. This energy started, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. I mean, I was just sitting in the car, and we were listening to Disney music, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until I thought that I would explode. And then it kind of, you know, let me go, you know, and I settled back down.
Sounds like a Kundalini thing.
Yeah, that's what I suspect, but I don't know enough about Kundalini to say that for sure. But that's what I suspect.
Next week I'll be interviewing a guy all about Kundalini. We'll be talking about that a lot.
Oh, I'll have to listen to that then. Yeah. I suspect it was something like that, because after that's when things really start rolling. Mm-hmm. You know, after that I start having lots of visions, and I'm not going to go through what all of those visions were. That would just take too long. But there were many, many useful visions. And maybe 1 or 2 will come up depending on what else we talk about. But around November,
Let me just
I
interject a point here. Do you feel it'd be useful to say, or do you feel it'd be true to say, that not everybody is wired to have visions?
Yeah,
Some people
absolutely.
are wired in different ways. Because if you say, if we place visions as sort of the criterion of spiritual awakening or something, then people who don't have them feel like they're scum of the earth, like you were saying earlier. You know, oh God, I never have visions. Nothing ever happens to me. I must be really uninvolved. So you just have to sort of, you know, people are wired in different ways, and it results in very different types of awakenings and different types of experiences.
Well, and in fact, I would say, even though the visions happen to me, and I mean this genuinely and sincerely, those types of experiences are absolutely unnecessary.
Right.
And for people who are seeking them, it is probably a distraction.
Mm.
And I would recommend letting go of that and looking for something more genuine. And maybe we'll get into talking about
Sure.
some things
Yeah.
more genuine. You know, I don't think that you can make a vision happen.
Yeah.
You know, it either happens or it doesn't, and overall it's irrelevant. Ultimately, it has nothing to do with truth. You know, there's another teaching I share, which I don't want to go all the way into right now. It's a pretty big teaching, but in that teaching, I show, you know, illusion kind of as a box, you know, or the untrue kind of as a box. And within that box are many, 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 many things. And one of those things would be things like visions. They can point to truth. And in my case, they did, but they are not the truth. Therefore, they're not necessary.
Yeah. And, you know, to quote Mick Jagger, people, or paraphrasing, people kind of get what they need, you know. So maybe some people need visions, and so they're going to have them, and others don't need them, and so on. And like you say, I mean, most of the, there's all kinds of great scriptural accounts in various traditions about people having visions, like Saul on the road to Damascus and so on. And in general, they weren't seeking them. They just got zapped.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what happened to me. I mean, I wasn't seeking them.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, you know, being this girl from Kansas, the idea of them is ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know, if you go back to that girl, you know, anybody who's having visions must be, you know, a little crazy.
Mm.
So, yeah. In fact, that leads right into my next story very well.
Good.
In early November, I had a vision, which I am going to describe, while doing a course lesson. And the vision was that I was in this deep, dark cavern, and it was, you know, so dark that, of course, you know, you couldn't see anything, not your hand in front of your face, nothing. It was completely black. But intuitively, I knew there were a lot of people in that cavern with me. Also, intuitively, I knew there were many ways to get out of the cavern, several different exits, but nobody could find them because it was so dark. And I was standing there with an armful of lit candles, and people would come up to me, and I would take a candle and hand it to them, and then they would use the candle to find their own way out. And when that vision ended, I knew that was some kind of a calling, and I didn't want my mind to get involved with trying to figure it out. So I did something that day that I can't explain why I did it, because I'd never done anything like this before or even thought about doing anything like this. But I went to the computer and I said a prayer, and I said, if you are trying to tell me something, just tell me in a way that I can understand. And my fingers started typing. This was different. Now, you know, we'll have stories in a moment about when I was a scribe. This was different than any of my scribal experiences that followed. This, I would imagine, was more like a Ouija board type of experience, in that the fingers were typing, but I wasn't hearing anything in my head. I wasn't thinking. I was reading off of the screen. And the message that I read off of the screen was an invitation to, well, this thing, I'll call it for now, this energy, whatever this was, it introduced itself to me as the teacher of God. And I knew what it meant by teacher of God. I knew that it meant that we are God and we have forgotten, so it's teaching us to remember who we are. So it introduced itself to me as the teacher of God, and it said that's what is needed now are teachers.
So just to clarify that, so it's it's teaching God. I mean, you're saying it's teaching God. In God in our form, who have forgotten that we are God. Yeah. Okay.
Like you might say, I'm the teacher of first graders.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Teacher of God. I'm the teacher of God.
and it sounds a little, presumptuous to say I am teaching God. I mean, who can teach God? But what you're saying is it's we're God in human form, having forgotten our true status, and it's sort of helping to wake us up. That's
this wisdom, I now just call it inner spiritual wisdom. This wisdom is somehow, I don't know how, but it is our true wisdom, our remembrance of truth, and it has many ways of speaking to us. And so this is how it started for me. So it introduced itself as the teacher of God, and it said that teachers were needed now. It asked me to write for it, and it said you can do that. You are doing it now. Yeah. And then it asked me to teach what I write, and it told me that's how I would learn. Now, this is pretty amazing if you think about it, because I was a beginner, and I didn't have any arrogance about me. I mean, I didn't see myself as anything but a beginner. I didn't have any arrogance about me that I could go out there and teach others. The thought had never even crossed my mind. So this is a pretty amazing experience. And immediately when the experience happened, there was also just this huge feeling of peace. And I said yes. But then immediately after I said yes, it's like the peace collapsed and it was replaced by incredible fear. At this point in my life, I had never felt fear like this. As I later went through purification, I found there are greater levels of fear. But at this point, this was the most fear I had ever felt. And I just walked up and down. I had this long hallway in my house at the time, and I just walked up and down the hallway, rubbing my arms, just saying that I was going to do this in a way that I'd have to tell another story to get into exactly how I did it. But just saying that I was going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And the fear went away after about 2 hours. And when the fear went away, I felt this intuitive prompt that I was going to go see a movie. And it was a Sunday, and I remember that my daughter and I had plans that day. I don't remember what it was, but it wasn't to go see a movie. And I went and I pulled up, I lived in the Boston area then, so I pulled up one of these huge...
The Boston area.
Yeah. I pulled up one of these huge cinemas that have 30 movies or something, and I'm scanning down the list. And my eyes land on this movie called Shall We Dance? And I know that's the one. And it's a movie starring Richard Gere and Jennifer Lopez. So I went to this movie, and I wasn't actually that interested in the movie, which is funny. And I might have left, except that I felt strongly there was going to be a message in the movie for me. And the message came very clearly in a scene where Jennifer Lopez is teaching Richard Gere to ballroom dance. And he's not doing a very good job of learning. And so she finally says, stop. Don't think. Don't move unless you feel it. And I knew those were my instructions because I had just been asked that morning to write and teach. And I knew that it was never to come from me, that I wasn't to sit down and think about what to write or think about what to teach or even think about when to write or when to teach. It was this don't move unless you feel it thing. And I understood those instructions perfectly. I don't know how, because I know that some people, when they hear those same words, don't, but I knew exactly what that meant. And the very first scribing, what I call scribing, came the very next morning. I'll just pause there and take a drink, see if you have anything.
Oh, sure. No, I don't. You're doing good. I don't have any questions at the moment. I have some questions that I want to ask in a few minutes, but it's not quite ready. Yeah.
All right. Well, the way, just for anyone who doesn't know, the way this scribing happened was I would hear, I call it a voice, but it wasn't really a voice. It was, thoughts, like you can hear your own thoughts when you're talking to yourself. I would hear thoughts, but they weren't mine. At least at that point, that's how they felt. They weren't mine. Mm-hmm. They also didn't come into the head from the same place. I can feel thinking. It seems to happen up here, is what it feels like. And these came in back here. They entered from another location. Yeah. And I was just like a secretary writing. So that's what scribing was like. And at this point, I was still doing the Course in Miracles. So what would happen during the day when I was contemplating the workbook lesson for the day is the scribing would start, and it would explain things to me, or possibly in some cases even take me beyond the Course in Miracles workbook lesson that I was on. So I began to learn with really great clarity as a result of this inner voice, I'll call it.
Yeah. I guess one question I would ask, which is something I've always wondered, is, both contemporarily, there are a lot of people who are channeling in various ways, and then in terms of ancient stuff, there are all kinds of stories of accounts of people, being zapped with some wisdom and coming out with all kinds of profound stuff, which is, how did they know that? They never received that training. They're very young, this and that. They just somehow all of a sudden wake up to some wisdom and start speaking. And so I'm always kind of curious about the mechanics of that, I mean, is if we think of it in terms of the Holy Spirit or something, as some kind of universal amorphous field of intelligence but it seems more volitional than that, more intentional, like, okay, I'm choosing this person to speak through, and that kind of gives it a feeling like there's some sort of entity, that some wise being living on some other plane that's choosing its spokespeople, and then again, one might think, oh well, you just kind of maybe these people are just tapping into a deep level of creativity. Obviously, there have been all kinds of creative people in the world who've come out with beautiful music and literature and so on, and there is that talk of a muse that inspires you to do such things. But maybe there's just a deep field of creativity within each of us, which doesn't have any sort of personality or anything. It's just like an ocean of potential, and we somehow tap into that and start speaking or writing profound things that we didn't know we knew. I mean, so have you thought about those kind of questions?
Well, of course. And as we get further in my story, what we'll hear is that I experienced different personalities. However, in the end, the last personality being that of Ramana Maharshi, but in the end, well, let me just jump to Ramana Maharshi really quickly.
Okay.
One thing that was interesting about Ramana Maharshi was I didn't know of him. I mean, I heard the name, and that's the extent of it. And in fact, I knew so little of him that I called him Ramana, because I really had seen the name written. I didn't know it was Ramana.
Sure.
Right. And we'll tell in a little bit when we get to that part of the story how Ramana woke up in me. But when Ramana woke up in me, what was very, very interesting is I knew nothing about this person as a man, and I found all that out later. But I knew him so well because he was myself, not the man, but what he
the essence of
realized, what he is and what I am was the same. And it was just so beautiful to have him wake up in me, because it was like coming home.
Yeah.
It was like, that's who I've always been. I've been pretending to be somebody else. It feels so good to have, the genuine be here. So at that point, the idea that these were different personalities dissolved.
Yeah.
It's like that was a temporary thing. This was my true self speaking to me, and that's as far as I can go. I can't go any further than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's also true that the essence of who you are is identical to the essence of who Groucho Marx was, but I guess what you're saying is that, in the case of some enlightened being like Ramana, there's going to be the potential for vast wisdom to be conveyed. Okay.
When I say that I knew him as me, underneath all of us, underneath who we think we are, or behind, or beyond, or above, whatever word you want to use, there's a truth. There's a genuine truth of what we are. And most people are not at all aware of that. And so they think themselves to be these people that they think themselves to be. But Ramana was such an embodiment of the true self that I recognized my true self in that, and I knew myself. I knew it was me. There wasn't any doubt. So it was that place, like if you were to take a hand as different bodies, here's where the hand is here's where all these different things are the same.
Mm-hmm.
He took me here,
Right.
where we're the same. And so he and I were the same. And, anybody else that I would have had that experience with that was as realized as him would have been able to take me to the same place. Mm-hmm. It's just, circumstances turned out to be that it was, Ramana that took me there. But yeah, it was really, really, really sweet because I had no conscious, intellectual memory of that as who I am. Yet the moment that I was taken there, I knew it.
Yeah.
And it was like coming home.
So this may sound like a divergent question, but it's something that puzzles me, and I'd just like to hear your take on it. And it's sort of similar to what I asked a few minutes ago. I mean, I've interviewed a bunch of people who had experiences with Ramana, sometimes before they ever even knew who he was or had ever heard of him or anything else. Pamela Wilson and Nick Gonzitano and some other people have had experiences of seeing him, or almost literally seeing him in some kind of form in their room or something, and later on discovering, seeing a book and saying, hey, that's the guy I saw. So I'm just kind of curious about the mechanics of that. Is Ramana, because some people say, well, somebody liberated like Ramana, once the body drops, they're gone. They're just like a drop in the ocean, poof, never to be found again. But this kind of thing sort of implies that no, there's actually, Jesus is the same situation. There's so many stories of people having experiences of Jesus and having him intervene in their lives and so on. It begs the question, do these enlightened beings actually end up on some higher plane, working on human affairs from that place, or does the divine intelligence, which is just all-pervading, just take a form that we're going to recognize and be able to relate to, and being infinitely wise, it knows that we'll relate to Ramana or Jesus or something, even though they as entities have long since ceased to exist.
Yeah, well, this will take me back to, I told you I had multiple visions and I wasn't going to go through them all, but this will take me back to one of those early visions that I had. I had this vision, this happened at night, where I woke up from sleeping into just, again, light. I couldn't see anything, but I felt the presence of Jesus. I felt the presence of Jesus. And it was really interesting because this is very hard to describe, because Jesus was talking to me, but he didn't use any words. Mm-hmm. There were no words at all, yet I understood him perfectly. And when I spoke back, I used words because that's the only way I knew how to talk. So, I mean, there weren't thoughts. There was no language. It was a silent vibration that I understood perfectly. And what he showed me was that when awakening happens with, what appears to be a particular personality, when awakening happens with that particular personality, the one that was there when the awakening happened, continues to get used by I would call it the one communication. Mm-hmm. So with that experience, I would say your latter choice, like the person.
So even when that body dies, the personality that inhabited that body continues to have some sort of existence and continue to be used.
All right, yeah, it's. I don't know if you could actually say it has an existence. It might be more like, I wish I had a doily around me. Like if I had you know what a doily is,
sure.
Right?
Yeah.
A doily doesn't really have any existence. It's nothing. But if I was to blow on it, it would kind of blow like it was alive. Mm-hmm. I would say that whatever would be that wind blowing, that's what has the existence. And the doily is just being used as a form of communication, maybe because people connect to it differently, so, but yeah, whatever personality is present when awakening occurs, that personality then becomes a part of what's being used by the one.
Okay.
How's that for an explanation?
Yeah, I mean, it still leaves some questions unanswered, but I don't know if we can answer them. There's a mystery here that is interesting to ponder. And
mysteries are great too, I think.
Yeah.
It keeps us from falling back into what you and I started talking about, which is beliefs.
Right. Yeah, and like I said at that time, working hypotheses. I mean, this is an interesting working hypothesis to sort of ponder for the rest of one's life if one is interested in such things.
All right, so let me jump back to my story then. So
Yes.
where we had left off was I was beginning to scribe with the workbook lessons of A Course in Miracles. I also started to receive very specific guidance. And I remember I had worked myself into what I thought was a pretty nice place. I had a really nice job. I lived in the town I wanted to live in. My daughter went to this great school that was so good she had to win a lottery to get into it because so many people wanted in it. So, you know, we were in this really nice position in the world. And I started receiving guidance to quit my job and move. And in fact, the guidance was very specific in that I was to move wherever my daughter wanted to move. And remember, my daughter was 6 or 7 at the time. So I'm supposed to go up to my 6 or 7-year-old daughter and ask her where she wants to live.
So you moved to Disneyland, right?
No, no, not quite. We moved to a place called Albemarle, North Carolina. Actually, we ended up getting a house in New London, which is right next to it. But the reason she wanted to move there is that's where my brother and her cousins live.
Oh, okay.
She wanted to be here near her cousins. And now that I look back on that, that was also very wise because this bought my daughter into the move, right? Her getting to pick the place, she's bought in, right? It's not happening to her. So I'm a single mom, and I'm a single mom who adopted from China. So there's no father in the picture. There's no one to give child support or anything like that. I'm the sole supporter of both her and I, physically. And so you can imagine the fear that starts coming when I'm to quit my job. And again, I'm raised from Kansas, and the Kansas culture is, you know, you work hard and make a living, and that's how you take care of yourself and your family. And so it was really, really frightening. And this is when I started to find out how great fear can be. You know, I began to experience fear sometimes at night that I thought the fear itself might kill me. Just, you know, great, great fear. And I would just lay in the fetal position and breathe.
Would it have a meaning attached to it, or would it just be sort of abstract fear?
Well, it was a little bit abstract, but it was, you know, like disasters coming. You know, like this is a really, really bad decision.
Like I'm going to go bankrupt or something.
Yeah, there weren't specific stories. It was just that general feeling of, oh my God, what are you doing? And the only reason I can say that I did it in spite of the fear, you remember the show when we were younger called Let's Make a Deal?
Yeah, I don't know if I ever watched it, but I remember the name of it.
Yeah, and Let's Make a Deal, what would happen is, what was his name? Bob? Oh, well.
Not Bob Newhart. It wasn't.
Bob Barker? Was that his name?
Bob Barker, right, yeah.
Okay, Bob Barker would go out into the audience and he'd pick someone and you know, he'd ask, like, do you have a stapler in your purse? And if you do, then you get to play along. And people would come with these big bags with all kinds of stuff in it. So he would find someone to play, and once he found someone to play, there would be 3 doors, and he'd ask them to pick whatever door they wanted, and they could have the prize behind the door. And it could be anything. It could be a trip to Hawaii, a new car. It could be a rubber chicken hanging on a string. It could be anything. And so sometimes they would pick, and it would be a pretty decent prize, like a washer and dryer. And then he'd say, okay, do you want to keep what you got behind
try for something
that door,
better,
or trade it for another door? It could be greater or less. Well, I felt like I had picked door number 1. That was the life that I had designed for myself. And that I had the washer and dryer. Like, it's a pretty decent life, pretty decent gift. And I felt like what this was asking me to do was asking me if I wanted to trade for what was behind door number 2. And there was just this feeling that if I didn't say yes, I would never be fully happy again, because I'd always wonder what would have happened if I had said yes. You know, like I couldn't be satisfied with the washer and dryer life anymore.
Right.
So that's what led me to say yes and quit my job and move to Albemarle, North Carolina.
Very brave of you.
Yeah.
Incidentally, before we get off Bob Barker, this has nothing to do with the interview, but if you ever watched the TV show Whale Wars?
No.
It's this great show about these really brave young people who were down in Antarctica opposing the Japanese whalers and preventing them from killing whales. But anyway, Bob Barker donated this really nice big ship for them to use in that endeavor. So just, you know, praise for Bob Barker here.
About 3 days before we moved, first of all, about 6 days before we moved, I finished A Course in Miracles. And when I say I finished A Course in Miracles, what I mean is I had read the manual for teachers twice, the text twice, and completed the workbook in the way it's supposed to be completed. So I finished A Course in Miracles. And about 3 days after that, which was 3 days before the move, I received a scribal message. It came through the inner voice, and it asked me to read the New Testament and to let the New Testament be interpreted for me. And it said that if I would realize that I didn't know what it meant, that it could interpret it for me. And then 3 days later we moved and we got to North Carolina, and we're settling in, and then one morning after we're settled in, I wake up and I hear it's time to begin. So what I did was I just started at the beginning of the New Testament with the book of Matthew, and I would just read. And when I would read, I would feel this intuitive prompt when to stop reading, and it varied. It could be a sentence, a paragraph, a story, whatever. But I would always know when to stop reading. And in the beginning, I always thought I knew what it meant. So the first thing I had to do was practice letting go of what I thought it meant. And the way I would do that is I would envision what I thought on a chalkboard in my mind, and then I would erase it. And when I was empty of what I thought it meant, and I only wanted to hear the interpretation that this inner wisdom would give me, then that inner voice, or that thought stream that comes from here, would begin, and I was just taking notes. And this went on for 13 and a half months. And that ended up being published. That's another story, but obviously we can't tell all the stories in a short interview.
Tell lots of them. No, I have long interviews.
Well, let's just put it this way. I didn't go looking for a publisher.
Yeah.
The publisher was it basically came to me. But the book ended up being published, and that's what we call the Holy Spirit's interpretation of the New Testament, or NTI, which stands for New Testament Interpretation. Mm-hmm. But from my perspective, what was interesting about NTI was it kind of met me where I was left off at the end of A Course in Miracles and took me further. So, and it also cleared up some confusions that I developed as a student of A Course in Miracles. There's something about the way the Course is worded and the way the ego reads the Course that can lead to a lot of very serious confusions. And those confusions were also undone through the writing of NTI. Mm-hmm. So NTI was my next step, and it's great that it's out there, for others, because there are others that are definitely finding it useful. But for me, this was a very personal thing. It wasn't about writing a book for others. It was about me and my awakening.
Yeah. There's a guy named, I think his name's Raphael Kushner, and he has this interview series called Teaching What We Need to Learn. And mm-hmm. I just like the phrase, because the best way to learn something is to teach it, or to be a scribe for it or something,
I
rather
agree.
than to just sort of passively be exposed to it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. So, and what I didn't tell you, by the way, was prior to all of this beginning, I kind of mentioned it, my professional career I was a corporate trainer and course writer. Mm-hmm. So it's not that odd that I should be selected for this kind of thing. It's kind of like selecting a musician to play music for God, or selecting a chef to cook for God, right? I mean, it's not that unusual. This was my
in your skill set.
Yeah, my talent, my skill set, exactly.
Yeah. One thing I wish, I was listening to the NTI, and since I'm not super familiar with the Bible, I wished that when you wrote it, you had read the New Testament passage, verbatim, and then just read your commentary, and gone back and forth. Because I would almost recommend people who actually read the physical book to have the Bible there and to go back and forth as you comment on each verse, to refresh their memory of what the Bible verse is.
And if you have the book NTI, whenever that's highly recommended that you read the Bible first, there's a little Bible icon at the beginning of the paragraph.
Right, okay, good.
Along with the verses. Also, just kind of as an aside, when I was the scribe for NTI and I scribed the book of John, I knew intuitively that there was more in the book of John than I was ready for. So the Book of John, I mean, it's okay, you know, but I always knew there was more there than I was ready for. In the last year, I went back through the Book of John. And I did that not writing, but as a teaching. I would read from the Bible, and then the interpretation would come, and I spoke it live. So, and it's really, I think it's really just much more clear because I'm ready for more now.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to listen to that, and I am reading the Bible, if you just go to reginadonakers.com, underneath audios, you'll find a teaching called The Guiding Light. And The Guiding Light has a link there for me reading the Book of John and having it interpreted just in the last year. And it's really phenomenal. So some people might enjoy that.
Yeah. Have you ever done anything with the Gnostic Gospels?
No, I haven't.
That'll keep you busy for...
People often ask me to do the Old Testament too, and I've just never felt that prompt. So I haven't done that either.
Okay.
So after NTI came, and again, a publisher showed up. And so, you know, I was doing all this stuff that you have to do to get it ready for the publisher. On the day that I sent it off, I said this prayer. And the prayer was something kind of like, you know, thank you for letting me do this. But I don't want this to stop. I knew that I was awakening, and I don't want this to stop. And I said, please send me something else that will take me higher into love. And I ended up meeting this man from Paris, France, who I immediately did not like, but started receiving guidance to join in a couple relationship with him. And he also started receiving the same guidance. Now, what's really interesting about this was I had a boyfriend that I'd been with, you know, 13 or so years, maybe 16 years. I don't remember exactly now. I'd have to do the math. But and I really, you know, I mean, there was nothing wrong with him. I wasn't in a relationship where I was trying to get rid of who I was with. But this guidance just kept coming. So when I finally accepted the guidance, what happened is this man lives in Paris, and
had you met in person or just over the internet?
We had met. He had come to one of my retreats for a weekend, and so I had met him for a weekend. And like I said, I didn't particularly like him. So this definitely wasn't a romantic attraction kind of thing. It just had nothing to do. It felt like what I would call an arranged marriage. Yeah, that's what it felt like. Yeah. But when I finally surrendered to it was somebody sent me a scripture. Like they said, this is my daily scripture for the day. It was a Christian person that I knew. And she said, I just felt like sending this to you. And she knew nothing about what was going on with me. And the scripture was from Ecclesiastes. And it was something about how two people are better than one on the spiritual path. You know, basically was the gist of the scripture. And I understood, you know, that spoke to me. But what was really interesting was I talked to him on the phone that night, and he told me how he had checked out this spaghetti western video, and, you know, he hated the movie, but he's watching the movie anyway because he really felt guided to do it. And for some reason, right in the middle of the movie, they put on the screen, and it was the exact same scripture.
Two people are better than one.
Yeah, whatever. I'd have to look up the scripture to get the exact wording, but that was the idea. And
That's interesting.
It was the exact same scripture from Ecclesiastes. So when that happened within the same 24-hour period, that's when I thought, okay, I need to do this. So I broke up with my boyfriend, and of course, at first, he felt very rejected.
Yeah.
And he's not on the spiritual path at all. He has zero interest in it. So I tried to explain it to him as best that I could. And I told him, I used words that I thought he might understand. I told him I wanted to be enlightened in this lifetime and that this relationship had something to do with that, and I needed to do this. And his response was, all right, well, if this is God, I know God loves me too, so I'm going to wait for you.
Huh.
That was his response. By the way, I'm still with him now. I'm back with him. We've been together 25 years now.
Wow.
So. But at that time, I didn't know that I would ever be going back with him. I even asked him not to wait for me, but he did. And so I joined into this relationship with this French gentleman, and he comes to North Carolina and lives with me. I always tell people our first date was living together for 6 weeks. He would come and go for the year and a half because he was always on just a tourist visa.
Right.
So he would come and go. And our first experience with one another was pure hatred. I mean, I didn't even know that I was capable of hating that much. Other than the fact that we both wanted to awaken, we had nothing in common. We were just polar opposites. He was kind of raised, rich Paris, French, Jewish, all of that, which has one culture to it. I'm from Kansas. He was like a night person. He wouldn't even get up till 11, 12, 1 o'clock. He'd take another nap at 5 in the afternoon. Then he was up all night. I'm like, get up 6 in the morning, go to bed at 9 at night. He eats dinner at midnight, 10, 11 midnight. He perceived me as ugly, and I perceived him as a weak specimen of a man. Like, he didn't know how to do, the men that I knew how to do things like mow lawns, maybe some plumbing. He didn't know how to do anything, So we weren't that fond of each other. But
to
what
say the
was
least.
What was really, and also, this was a big one for me. Remember that I had left my job, and when I left my job, I sold my house in Boston, where houses are more expensive in Boston than they are in North Carolina. So I was able to take the equity out of that house. I was able to pay cash for a house in North Carolina, and I had $50,000 left over. But by now, I'd been there a few years, and this $50,000 was dwindling down. I wasn't receiving any donations. I didn't have any income whatsoever. And this guy comes along and starts really spending my money.
Whoa.
He didn't have
I thought you said
money.
he was rich.
No, yeah, but he was rich through his father, and his father cut him off when he came to live with me.
I see.
So he had no money of his own, and he was really spending my money, and he had ideas that you had to have the most expensive of everything, where I'm trying to be frugal. And I remember the day I had just the hugest meltdown into hate I ever had. It's kind of a funny story that had to do with butter. He bought like this, $5 a pound butter, when it could have been $1, or less, and I just, just this meltdown. It was just so wasteful. It was my money and just so much hate.
I got to throw in a funny story here. Sorry to interrupt. My wife and I did our honeymoon in North Carolina in the mountains up near Boone or someplace like that, and in a friend's cabin. And one time we went into this little tiny store. It was miles from anywhere, and we asked for butter, and there were these characters standing around, and they all thought that was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. They were all going, "Butter!" And we still tell that story like 30 years later.
What's that famous movie where those guys go down the river?
Oh, yeah, that famous movie where the guys go down the river and it's real scary and redneck territory. That's what it was like. Yeah, I forget the movie. I think yeah. Go ahead. Anyway.
Tell her I said hello, by the way, because I haven't been able to speak.
Regina says hello.
Well, one thing that was really interesting, in spite of all this hatred, and again, he would, tell me how ugly I was and all this kind of stuff. And one thing that was really interesting about this was, in spite of all of this, because of the way the relationship had come about, we both knew that there were healing opportunities for us, or awakening opportunities for us in this relationship. And so we sat down, hating each other, and we held hands, and we said a prayer, and I don't remember exactly what we said in that prayer, but basically the prayer, the gist of the prayer was, this relationship is only for awakening. What is it that we need to see? And a whole nother scribing started from me. Now that NTI was done, I started scribing these messages from, again, what at that time we called Holy Spirit, that were directly to me and him about what needed to be let go in us, about what the errors were in our minds, the beliefs, the perceptions, the attachments that were causing all of the hate, and how we could let those go. And one teaching that came during that time, through these messages, that I think was really important, was something that we called the code. We picked the name for it. But the idea behind the code is very simple, actually. The idea is that when a thought comes into the mind, that thought comes into the mind actually from the oneness. We perceive it as an individual thought, but it's not. it may have an individual type of story to it, but the thought comes into the mind from the oneness. And what's not really real about the thought, because no thoughts are real, but what's most real about the thought is not the story the thought is telling, but the content of the thought. So, for example, I'm a pretty neat and clean person, and this gentleman was not. And so one of the thoughts in my mind was about what a slob he was all of the time. And so what I was shown was, although I could look around the house and I could find the proof that he was a slob, I was right, what I needed to do was kind of look under the covers of the thought instead of looking at the story. And when I look under the covers of the thought, that was a hate thought. And that if I believe that hate thought, I'm going to experience hate. And remember, I told you that I was experiencing great hate at this time. And if I wanted to be free of hate, if I wanted peace and joy and, all as my actual experience, that I really can't be digesting these hate thoughts. I can't go around on a diet of hate thoughts and expect to have an experience of, peace, love, and joy. So what I was taught to do was to look at a thought, to look beyond the story, to look at the content, and to realize I don't want that. So, it comes in, what a slob he is. I look underneath, that's a hate thought. I don't want hate. Therefore, I let go of this. And so I learned to look at thoughts in a different way, and I learned to then not accept them, not, I don't mean resist them, but not believe them, not digest them. And I learned to just let thoughts go by realizing I don't want the content. It could be a hate thought, it could be a fear thought, it could be an unworthiness thought, it could be a guilt thought. And the question was, do I want these things as my experience, or do I want something else as my experience? And I really learned to let go of these story level thoughts that appeared true because of the content and because of my desire for peace and joy and love.
Sounds very Byron Katie-ish.
Yeah, I suppose it is. I didn't know her then, but I suppose it is. So for a year and a half in this relationship, this is basically what was happening. There was one story after another, and I would see the falsehood in it and learn to let it go. One really big story that a lot of people enjoy. There was a point, in spite of the fact that we started with hate, hate was the first thing I learned to let go of as far as content. I learned to let go of it. I learned that hate isn't real, that literally we only experience hate if we, buy into hate thoughts. And if you don't buy into hate thoughts, you can't experience hate because it's not there by itself, right?
Hey, since you're speaking of thoughts, a question came in from a fellow named William in Miami. And he asked, people speak of extinguishing the mind. How does this happen? If we don't have any thoughts, what do we have? I don't think you're saying you didn't have any thoughts. You're talking about hate thoughts, but you could probably answer that question.
Yeah, I can answer that question to a point.
Mm-hmm.
My mind is not extinguished, so that's why I say to a point. But there is significantly less mind than there used to be. It's almost like it's thinning, right? It's thinning and thinning and thinning. And each time it thins a little more, the intuition is greater. Mm-hmm. In fact, I recently went through another thinning just in the last month and a half or so, and the intuition is like 1,000 times what it was prior to that thinning of the mind. So there's this natural wisdom of the universe. I mean, I think the point of the question is there's this belief that we have that I am the person and that I need this mind, this person mind, to take care of me, protect me, keep me safe, all of that. And that's not true. We're not the person, therefore we don't need the person mind. We're something far beyond the person. In fact, you could say we're the intelligence that made up the people. Therefore, we have far greater intelligence than the little person does. And so as we let go of the person, we realize this far greater intelligence, and it does a much, much better job. That's the answer.
That's a good answer.
So back to the story.
Yes.
So the next story I was going to tell, in spite of the fact that we started with hatred, hate is the first thing I learned to let go of. I really worked very hard on those hate thoughts. And it's actually amazing how quickly it died for me, because I just saw that it wasn't real and I didn't have to believe it, and it just died. And after Haight died for me, there was this little period where we seemed to fall in love. It didn't last long. It was very brief, but we seemed to fall in love. He is a very romantic Frenchman. I just thought, this is heaven. You know, this is great. And one day, for a reason that I didn't know about then, years later, he explained it to me, but I didn't know then, he left my bedroom. You know, we were sleeping together, of course. He left my bedroom and he moved into the guest room and he began to avoid me. As I mentioned, he was a night person. I was a day person. I would go into my room at night to go to bed and close the door. And 5 minutes after I came out, he would come out. And he lived in the house at night. I lived in the house during the day. And if our paths happened to cross, he was looking at me with just so much, he still had the hatred. He was looking at me with so much hatred. And I felt, what came up in me then was,
surprising that he would keep coming. And I mean, you said he had to keep coming and going because of visa problems. It's surprising to me that he would keep coming back.
Yeah, well, he did.
Yeah.
So there was this feeling of rejection. And again, this is when that, you know, the best way to describe it is I'm the ugliest woman on the planet Earth. I'm the most useless person on the planet Earth. Why should anybody want? I mean, just all this stuff started really coming up. And it was, my heart was broken. You know, I just thought I had the greatest thing in the world, and now all of a sudden it's taken away. And it was really a very difficult time. But when I sat down with the inner wisdom to look at it, first the inner wisdom asked me if I had ever felt this before. And I could remember, of course, feeling rejected before in previous relationships. And so the inner wisdom asked me if I could then accept that this was in me and had nothing to do with him and the situation. And at first I lied to inner wisdom. How stupid is that? I said, yeah, I can. And then I went, no, I can't. I can't accept that this is me and not him. You know, he is definitely rejecting me. And that's why I feel this way. And the inner wisdom said that it wasn't him. That what it was my own belief in how rejectable I was. You know, right? That's what was hurting me, not him. And it just asked me to do this simple thing that every time a thought crossed my mind that that he was somehow hurting me, he was rejecting me, for me just to say to myself, you know, I'm not going to say his name here because actually he's also a spiritual teacher. Wow. But you know, it's not X that is rejecting me. It's my own belief in my own rejectability. And just to say this every time. And so I started practicing that. And it was really interesting because, you know, in a normal relationship, he would have moved out. He would have gone back to Paris and, you know, he hated me. We'd never see each other again. This guy's living in my house. Yeah. So I have to deal with this every day, which also the inner wisdom told me that was a very fortunate situation because I did have to deal with it. If he had left, I might not have, right? So every time that pain would come up and this idea that he was somehow hurting me, rejecting me, I would say that. And after, it seems to me now, about 2 months, I still had that broken heart, but I began to feel what felt like light around it. And I knew that it was ending. And within about 24 hours, it ended. And the way I see changed completely. The belief in rejection died in me. So I am no longer capable of even seeing rejection. I mean, I see people break up and I see people say mean things to each other, but I don't see it as rejection. Sometimes I see it as a natural progression of this is what was supposed to happen now. Sometimes I see it as a person believing their thoughts and being in pain and acting it out, but I don't actually see people reject each other anymore. That just died. And when it died, I could no longer see him rejecting me. I could only see a brother who was in great pain and needed assistance. And at that point, I became his friend. So, you know, again, there's lots of stories like this in that relationship. For a year and a half, it was just a healing relationship. And I like to say I probably saved 1,000 years, maybe 1,000 lifetimes in that year and a half. And there's an element of truth to that. Then one day, after about a year and a half, I got up and I was contemplating the Tao Te Ching, and I got a very unique contemplation that day. It just had to do with that day. It's never come again when I've read the Tao Te Ching. But that day when I was reading the Tao Te Ching, I had a vision, where he and I were walking down this road together, and we came to a fork in the road, and one part of the fork was staying as a couple, and the other part of the fork was no longer being a couple. And I was told we needed to go down the no longer being a couple fork now, because he was feeling possessed, and love doesn't possess, so we needed to let him go. And I was promised that everything else I still needed for my awakening, I would continue to get, that there was no loss in this. So when he woke up that day, which was much later than me, I told him this, and at first he seemed shocked, and then this big smile just crossed his face. And it turns out that the night before, while I was asleep, he was out walking my dog around midnight, and again, he's kind of this romantic Frenchman, so he's talking to the moon, and he said to the moon, that he wanted to serve his father. And he said, but can't I have fun too?
His heavenly father, you mean?
Yeah, his heavenly father. But but can't I have fun too? And there was something in that, but can't I have fun too? There was something in that shifted. I like to say it shifted the universe. Mm-hmm. So without me even knowing about that, when I woke up the next morning, I had this vision. So in ending the relationship, it was actually a gift to him. And I think it was a very important gift for him, because I think the reason he stayed in the relationship as long as he did is because it did feel like a guided relationship. And I think that he thought he would somehow be bad if he left a relationship that, God or the universe had put him in. Right. And now that same thing was setting him free from it. So it was kind of a communication that it was okay, that he's allowed to feel what he feels and thinks what he thinks. So it was really a very beautiful, beautiful thing. And that's how that relationship ended. And then, my current boyfriend and I, we just went right back together like nothing ever happened. And we've been together ever since. So
interesting how we have karma to work out with some people, and lessons to be learned with some people.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. And he and I, we have this really genuine love for each other now,
Right.
Like, people often ask that, well, do you love him now? Well, absolutely. Yeah. How can you not love someone that you go through so much healing with?
Right. Yeah.
So, but he has his life and I have mine.
Right.
He is the French publisher of NTI.
Oh.
So the next thing that happened in the story is that one advantage to having him around, because again, we were so opposite, is I learned to be very inward focused on intuition. So he would say something, and instead of reacting from the head or from the personality, I would kind of, in my own way, ask intuition, how am I to see this? What am I to think? What am I to say? Not asking questions, but just this checking in thing.
Just checking in, yeah.
Yeah, and I was really, really inward. When he left, it got easier, and I actually dropped that habit of being inward. And I went back to thinking again. Mm. And it was hell. After living without the thinking mind as your primary mode of transportation, to come back to it was really, really difficult. And after about 3 months, sometimes I always tell people I'm a very slow learner. 3 months of hell, I finally said another prayer, and this time I asked for something that would take me to the next step. And immediately, I felt guidance to go on Amazon.com and order this book from Ramana Maharshi. And again, I knew the name. I knew literally nothing else. And when I went to Amazon.com, I knew exactly which book to order. I just knew. So I ordered it. And when the book came a few days later, I expected to open it and just oh, this is the greatest thing ever. But I couldn't understand it. I had never, ever, ever been involved in anything outside of somewhat of a Christian tradition. A Course in Miracles is a Christian tradition. NTI obviously is a Christian tradition. So I didn't know any of the terms that are used in this book. I just couldn't understand it. So I threw the book down, and it laid there for a couple of weeks, as I remember it now. And one day I was sitting near where I had thrown the book down, doing my morning meditation and contemplation. And on the cover of this book is this lovely, lovely picture of Ramana Maharshi. And what started happening was that picture started to come alive. He would come out of the book like a 3D person, and then go back in, and come out of the book and go back in. This was a very real thing that was happening. This wasn't a vision. I mean, I've experienced visions. This seemed real, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And silly me, I tried to ignore it. This was disturbing my meditation, my contemplation. this thing happening, and then I heard what I had called the Holy Spirit. I heard that familiar inner voice ask me. It said, "Ask him what he wants to say to you." And so I did. I asked him what he wanted to say to me, and that's when I say, and Ramana Maharshi woke up in me, is just the way I word it. But that's when I began to experience him, and I began to receive messages from him. Again, for me, sometimes people say that's not what Ramana taught, and I don't know. I think sometimes they're wrong, actually, but also I think Ramana taught whatever the person in front of him needed to hear. He taught that one, and so he obviously from inside of me taught me.
He did. He taught all kinds of stuff.
Yeah,
I
think so too.
He said, meditate, don't meditate,
Yeah.
do self-inquiry, don't do self-inquiry, do service, don't do service. I mean, according to the person's need.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. When people narrow him down to one teaching, I think they're really narrowing him down.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's when this next, and it ended up being a book also. Again, I didn't seek to publish it. A guy walked up to me and told me he was willing to start a publishing company and publish this book. So that's how that happened. But that's when these messages started coming. They're now called the teachings of inner, I still say Ramana. I still say Ramana because that's how I knew him then. Mm-hmm. The teachings of inner Ramana. I say Ramana Maharshi and inner Ramana, so I say it differently. But that's when these messages began to come, and this is how I learned about self-inquiry. So I learned about self-inquiry from within. And I was actually taught, you can almost say two forms of self-inquiry, but actually they work together. But one I call little s self-inquiry and the other one capital S self-inquiry. But the first type of self-inquiry is like this. So let's say that I'm nervous about my interview with, the great Rick Archer. And really, I do love you, and I think you know that. But anyway, so I'm nervous about my interview with Rick Archer, and all these thoughts are in my mind about, the interview. Well, the way the self-inquiry works is the first thing that I would ask is basically a question like, what is it that sees these thoughts? And when I ask, what is it that sees these thoughts, what happens is a detachment from the thoughts. And I know you know this. Suddenly I see that I am the one looking at the thoughts, not thinking the thoughts. So that first question, who is it that sees these thoughts? Before me and the thoughts were like this, now it creates some space. But then after that space is created through the first question, who sees these thoughts? The next question is, who am I? And that turns around and looks at the true self, right? And so it's really two questions. One, just to create some space, and then two, to turn around and look at the true self. And that was the form of self-inquiry that I learned from Inner Ramana. And so that is the self-inquiry that I have practiced and still practice.
And it's pretty effective for you.
It's extremely effective.
Yeah.
And
it's
then,
interesting how things are effective for you. I mean, you do a prayer, you get a result. You do some sort of self-inquiry, you get a result. I mean, not everybody, I think, gets such immediate results with things. So that says something.
I have a partial theory about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think my theory is it depends on what you want.
Mm.
Like from the time this whole thing has started, I have wanted to know truth. And I think some people, they kind of want to know truth. Maybe they even more want to be enlightened. I think wanting to be enlightened is a completely different thing than wanting to know truth, actually.
Is it?
But then they also still want the romantic relationship. They still want, this. They still want that. And so they have all of these different wants going in different directions, and they're conflicting. And that's why the results are different. I think that if you get to the point in your heart, in your genuine heart, where you really just want this one thing and you're willing to let everything else go, I think the results are much faster.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the last thing that Inner Ramana taught me was about 3 states of mind. One state of mind is called resistor. The next one is called doubter. And the last one is called abiding. And in fact, notice the resistor and the doubter have a person there, and abiding really doesn't. It's not abider. Mm-hmm. And what I was taught is that the resistor is the the average person in the world who really thinks they know who they are. You know, my name is Regina. I'm from Kansas. I like this and this and this. I don't like this and this and this. I want this. I don't want that. You know, that's the resistor, the person who fully believes that they're the person. The doubter is actually progressive on the spiritual path. The doubter is the person who is beginning to doubt that they are the person. They're beginning to question those thoughts. Is that who I am? They're also beginning to receive inner wisdom in some way, you know, maybe within, like I did, but maybe by, you know, listening to a great teacher like Adya or somebody like that. But, you know, they're receiving wisdom, they're getting inner confirmation, no matter how it's coming. But they don't see that as their wisdom. They still feel like the student learning, even it's so silly now to me, but even when I was receiving all this wisdom from within, I thought I was the student learning from something, you know, out there somewhere, right? And so that's the doubter. And the doubter is really kind of doubting in two directions. They're beginning to doubt that they're the person, but they also still doubt that they're the true self, right? So that's the doubter. And then abiding is the one who accepts, this is what I am, and then just becomes that, just lives that, you know. So what I was told was that I had a very healthy doubter stage now, but it was time for me to move into abiding, that I no longer needed to pretend to be the student talking to an inner voice, that I had enough experience with this inner wisdom that I knew that it was always here, always available, you know, and so that I could just let go of that doubter phase and begin abiding. And that's when you could say any sense of a voice ended for me. It would have to at that point, because if it had stayed, it would have left me stuck in the doubter phase. So that was the end of my scribal experience, and that was in 2009.
So that's like 7 years ago. So you haven't done any sort of scribing of any kind since then?
No, I do contemplation, and the way I experience contemplation is that I have realizations, and I put them in my own words. So no longer a scribing experience.
Yeah. So what you just told us about those three things, would that be a summation of what's contained in the Inner Ramana book?
Well, there's two other things in the Inner Ramana book that I didn't mention. One is it does teach that surrender. Remember, I had used that surrender in my relationship with the Frenchman, and then I had gotten away from it. So the first thing it does is it puts me back there. Yeah. It puts me back into, you know, being focused within as to what am I to do, what am I to say, how am I to see this, right? And then the second thing it did was it taught me a mantra. The mantra was, I am that I am. And the purpose of the mantra was to move out of just endless mind wandering. So like if you're doing dishes and, you know, the mind is just doing whatever it does, when you notice that, you take a moment to be silent, to drop into the heart, and then you say, I am that I am. And then you just linger there. And in fact, this also created another shift. There have been many, many, many shifts along the way. And of course, I'm skipping so much in the story. But saying that mantra is what really helped me to become aware of you know, the self that lives behind the self. You know, the changeless nature. And it was saying that mantra. It wasn't an intellectual understanding of the mantra. It was just saying it. Something about saying that mantra on a regular basis. You know, I still remember the day that I realized, you know, the self. I was just walking across the yard. I think I was going over to my neighbor's yard to get their dog. I used to get their dog every day and bring it to my house to hang out with my dog. And I was just walking across the yard, and all of a sudden, just, you know, I realized I'm not this person. You know, that's not what I am. You know, I'm this. You know, I don't know what to call this. I would call it, if you're going back to A Course in Miracles in that language, you know, in the beginning of A Course in Miracles, it says, nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. I'm that something real. You know, like I'm that something real that can't be threatened. That would be the words that I probably would have put on it. But something in saying the mantra on a regular basis helped me to get there and to see that. At first, as little glimpses, it would like come and go. But then through self-inquiry, you know, looking at it more and more and more. So, but the mantra helped get me there. And then self-inquiry is the third thing that it teaches. So it really teaches three tools. surrender, mantra, and self-inquiry. All three tools are really designed to help break our dependence on the thinking mind.
And so that thing stabilized eventually?
Yeah, it's mostly stable. I still have, now it's more like I have little glitches out rather than little glitches in.
Right.
To say 100% stable would not be true. But very, very stable. More, but every now and then there'll be a little glitch out, and they don't last long. I immediately see because of how I feel.
Yeah.
I immediately see when I've become attached to something, when I've made something important that isn't important, and I can just, take a breath, look at it, and shift back again.
Yeah. Even Nisargadatta said something like that. Someone asked him if they ever lost it or something. He said there might be some little moment, but immediately, shift back. It's one thing I liked in a recording that I think you made somewhat recently. It was a very sort of frank admission that, firstly, you don't like to say anything that you haven't experienced. I think that's what you said in that recording.
Yes.
And secondly, that you just have no sense of having finally arrived at anything, which is kind of a recurring theme for me in these interviews, because I'm not sure that anyone ever does finally arrive at anything. There's like, even though certain things can become stable, like your realization, there's always a next horizon, always some dimension in which further development can take place, at least as I understand it.
Yeah, well, as I was saying in that particular recording, what I was doing was I was teaching on a quote from the Yoga Vasistha.
Vasishta.
Oh, sorry. I told you I just read these things. I don't know anything. Right. Anyway, so Vasishta, say that again?
Vasishta.
Vasishta. Okay. And the quote was saying that there is no world, no mind, no I. Well, the no I part is easy. But the no world, the no mind part, that's still beyond my experience. And so if that is a truth, I accept it as a possibility. If you say no, that's not possible, you're not going to go anywhere, right? If I had said no when I had that first Peace Pilgrim, when I read that first Peace Pilgrim idea that we're all one, if I just said no, that's ridiculous, and closed the book and put it down, that would have been the end of the story right there. So you have to accept things as possibilities if the inside is somehow pointing you to look that way. But it's not my direct experience. I don't know that at some point there is an awakening that's so profound that there is no more world. However, with that said, I do have experiences that might point to that possibility. One experience that I had, and you might know about this, was I had an experience of being an apple.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I read about that, and I also had an apple experience, so I thought that was pretty interesting. Go ahead and tell the thing.
Wait, I want to hear what you said first. Who had that experience?
I also had an apple experience. So I found that was kind of amusing that you had one. But go ahead and tell your experience.
Ramana Maharshi are the grand teachers.
Yeah.
In my experience, it was I wasn't in meditation or anything like that. I was sitting on the bed in my bedroom with my daughter. She was watching Disney TV and eating an apple, and I was either paying bills or balancing the checkbook. I don't remember which, but doing something with the checkbook. And all of a sudden, I'm going to call it the true I, okay, what I really am, that I shifted into the apple, and I became the apple. And what's really interesting about this is that when I shifted, nothing human came with me. So I had no brain. I couldn't have thoughts like I'm an apple. I was an apple, and apples aren't human. So it was an entirely different experience. And when I was the apple, what was really interesting is I could still see.
Yeah.
People don't think that apples can see because they don't have eyes, but I could. And in fact, I could see better than I can with eyes, because I could see outside of me, inside of me, 360 degrees, wherever my awareness wandered, I could see. And it could wander anywhere, right? And the only thing I saw was light. I could see light. But there was kind of what I would call two types of light. So this was still what I call an experience of form, not beyond perception entirely. There was space, and space was kind of a clear light. It was a light, but it was like clear. And then there were objects, it could be any object. I'll use this. There were objects, and objects were like compacted light. It's almost like light crunched into light. And what I knew was that all of the light, whether it was the spacious light or whether it was the compacted light, it was all alive awareness, which is what I was. It was all the same as me. There was no difference. And again, this was all without thinking. That's amazing. It's just knowing. And while I was the apple, my daughter took a bite out of me, and her teeth were the same thing I am. You know, her teeth were also just this living awareness, compacted light. And so when her teeth came and took a bite out of me, it was an experience of like interacting with like, or sameness with sameness, or, you know, and it was a very, very, very joyous interaction. And then after that happened, I popped back into being human, and that's when all of the understanding came. But my point is, in the enlightenment of an apple, right? Because that's a type of an enlightenment, I would say. In the enlightenment of an apple, you could say there's no world.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So is a world something that a human body experiences, but the same alive awareness that we are as a blade of grass does not? I mean, you know, I
think there's also another sense in which there's no world, and I think that sense is perhaps best conveyed by the phrase "knowledge is different in different states of consciousness." Or we could say reality is different in different states of consciousness. I mean, you know, even physics will tell us there's a level of creation in which the world hasn't arisen, hasn't manifested, and that's very real, even perhaps more real than the phases in which the world has apparently manifested. And you know, whether you go for physics or spiritual teachings, there's this notion of levels or strata of creation, more and more and more manifest, and you know, and those levels are paradoxically unlike one another in for the most part. I mean, in physics, Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics have very little to do with one another. It's a totally different way of explaining the very same creation, and yet both are true, each in their own realm. So, you know, and there's a realm beyond both of those realms, which is unmanifest, in which there is no world.
Yes.
So it's like, and if you try to take a stand and say only Newtonian physics is correct and not quantum mechanics, or vice versa, or the perspective from which there is no world, then you've boxed yourself into a partial perspective, which doesn't take into account the totality of all the various realities simultaneously coexisting.
Yeah, now we're getting into the elephant story, right? It's a trunk.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, I had another experience also that kind of points to, you know, I don't know if you would say that this means there is a world or that there isn't a world, but the experience was what I would call the experience of the Big Bang. Mm-hmm. Except, you know, people talk about the Big Bang like it happened, you know, billions of years ago or something. And what I experience is that it's happening, you know, thousands of times per second.
Yeah. And I think there are physicists who would agree with that too.
Pardon?
I think there are some physicists who would agree with that too.
Yeah, I experienced that as a, you know, it wasn't a vision. It was like an experience. I felt it, I saw it, I knew it to be true. Mm-hmm. And I knew that the only reason the world appears exactly the same, I call those multiple universes. I mean, it's like a new universe every nanosecond. Mm-hmm. And the only reason the world is the same in each nanosecond is because our believing stays the same. You know, like if somehow we were able to really, really, you know, change the way that we believe, there's no reason why the next nano universe couldn't be a completely different nano universe, because it comes from us. But that's what I saw, is it's always coming, it's always going, it's not at all constant. And so in that way, you could definitely say there is no world when you think of a world as something that's constant, right?
Yeah. It's changing, and therefore it can't be real. But there's a stability to it. You know, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, creator, maintainer, destroyer. Mm-hmm. There are these different aspects which kind of counterbalance one another, and thereby provide some consistency and continuity to the world.
Yeah. So all that stuff is really cool. But I think that for me, you know, again, maybe this is also what's been helpful to me, is that I like to break it down to the simple. Mm-hmm. And for me, that stuff is all really cool. But what really matters is where I am now.
Yeah.
you know, and where seeing things like the world coming and going thousands of times per second, where that was helpful to me, is that helped me see, well, then I don't have to carry a grudge, you know. If Rick Archer sat here and said to me, you know, you're the stupidest person I've ever interviewed.
No, I've interviewed a few people who were more stupid. Yeah.
I mean, I don't have to carry a grudge. 'Cause, I mean, as soon as you're done saying that, that was a different universe.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason. I don't have to drag that into this universe. So that's how these types of experiences have been helpful to me. So to me, it's not the experience for the experience's sake. It's the experience for how the experience shifted me, how the experience is helping me see things that I didn't see before, and therefore awakening me.
That's great. And that's a nice example of living in the now, of course, which is very all in vogue, and ever since Eckhart Tolle popularized it. It's like, you know, yeah, the now of 10 seconds ago is not the now of now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's actually all kinds of beautiful teaching stories about this kind of thing, about, like, I've used this example before, but etching a line in stone versus drawing a line in sand versus making a line in water versus making a line in air. You know, in each case, the line gets less and less permanent, and according to the substance in which you make it. And it's said that the enlightened person is like line in air. They just, everything is deeply experienced. You can actually make a deeper line in air than you can in stone, but it's passed as soon as it's passed. You know, next moment, new thing.
And that gets very, very easy too. There's something about, it's like the past and the future collapse.
Yeah.
You know, like you don't have to make yourself stay in the now.
Right.
It just becomes a natural way of being.
Yeah. Good point. I mean, if it would be a strain to be trying to make yourself stay in the now all the time.
Yeah. It's just the past is falling away, and the future, you know, the future the stories about the future, the imagination about the future, that's what's gone.
Yeah.
So.
So you told us some of the key points of the Inner Ramana book. Did you manage to cover the key points of the NTI book? Anything in there that you want people to know about?
No, I think that NTI is for me it was an earlier.
It was a phase.
Earlier phase, yeah, and it's really about. You know, when I started NTI, I still firmly believed that if you said I was the stupidest person you ever interviewed, you hurt me. You know, you did that to me, and how could you? And the world is real, and you know, I hurt because of you.
Yeah.
And NTI is what moved me from that way into seeing that it really is about my thinking and what I'm believing, and teaching me how to let go of thoughts. So. And it also, one thing that NTI also teaches is about emotions, how to be with emotions until they die their own death.
Yeah.
Rather than repressing them. Just, you know, whether it's fear, guilt, anger, just, you know, letting it exist until it ceases to exist on its own, because it will, and staying out of the way. So it's really that phase. I call it the purification phase, but it's really that phase of the awakening process. And what's interesting, I mean, I've listened to some of your interviews, and what I find interesting is, of course, some people seem to have the awakening to the self behind the self before they go through the purification. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was the opposite. The purification came first. And I'll hear a lot of people who say that they are awake, and they say, but, they still have all this stuff. They still get angry. They still judge. And actually, I don't have all of that stuff.
Because you cleared it out largely.
You don't have to live with that, and
right.
I know that. So that's just to accept that as this is the way it is just not continuing that hike. I think there's no reason. You don't have to. It's not in a repression way. You know, what I'm about to say, I don't mean to encourage repression, but you don't have to experience hate and jealousy and guilt, and you can see through it. You can see how you make it. You can see it's not real. You can transcend it, and then you're a happy person. And yes, stuff still happens, but you're able to happily and with intuition manage it, deal with it.
Sure. I just want to say there's about 170 people watching the live stream, and we've only gotten one question, so it may be that people don't realize that they can submit questions. So if anyone wants to submit one, we might go on for another 10 or 15 minutes. And there's a page on batgap.com under the upcoming interviews menu, and or future interviews or something. Go there, and then at the upcoming interviews. Then at the bottom of that page, there's a form through which you can submit a question if you have one. Okay, so then Awakening Together. What is that?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. So the reason I moved to Pueblo, by the way, is it's a short story. I had a dream that told me to go to Pueblo. So I left North Carolina and I came to Pueblo. And shortly after I got to Pueblo, within a couple years of getting to Pueblo, I had this feeling to take what I called a year of increased silence. Mm-hmm. Being a single mother, I couldn't have complete silence. I had a daughter who I needed to be a mother to, but she was in school during the day. From about 7 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. And so I was in silence during that time. And I spent that time with a book called The 7 Steps to Awakening, which is actually just a collection of quotes from people like Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta, Yoga Vasista, the book, etc., things like that. And I would spend all day contemplating these quotes, and lots of great clarity came, and again, this was another giant step forward, and I could do lots of teachings on what came to me in that year. But at the end of that year, this guidance came. This guidance came to start a church, an online church, and I had great resistance. In fact, the first 2 people that I told that to, I couldn't even hardly get the word church out of my mouth. But the guidance came to start this online church, Awakening Together. I was given a purpose and 5 core values. The purpose being to awaken to one true self, but using any form of spiritual teaching that's helpful. So not specific to one mode, like we talked about, different people need different things. So it's not specific to just one mode of awakening. Whatever is helpful to point people towards awakening, that's a part of Awakening Together. And then the 5 core values were things like no one has spiritual intuition over another. Everyone has their own inner guidance. Again, not to make anything that is not the truth is not the truth. So, for example, to hold up NTI or A Course in Miracles or anything else and say, this is the truth, that's not it. That's just a pointer. There is only one truth, and it's, that which has no beginning, no ending, is absolutely changeless. All of these core values came. And so then our job, I got 2 friends to help me with this. Our job was to build this church. And a church is a legal entity. And so we needed to study the law, and we needed to learn what a church was, and we needed to become a church in the eyes of the law. And we did that. And it was quite a climb, because the law, at least the IRS, thought that a church meant physical building, and we're online. Right. And so we had to work a little harder to prove that we were a church than somebody with a building would. But we did. We got our church status, so we are an online church. And in some ways we behave like a church, because if we didn't behave like a church, they wouldn't see us as a church, right? So like we have a Sunday morning service. We have a minister program where you can become ordained as a minister. But all of that, I would say, is actually window dressing. The real purpose of this organization is to help people awaken, to help people find their own inner intuition that's going to guide them through their awakening, to help people get beyond the symbols and to see what the symbols are pointing to. It's also just wonderful. It's a wonderful way for people to join. Lots of people feel that they're alone in their communities, and we're online, so you can come together and join with others. So it's really a pretty cool thing. It's still relatively small. I think we have a little over 200 members, but it's really just a very cool thing. And if you go to our website, and you go to, and our website is awakening-together.org, and you go to the sanctuary menu, there you can get a quick start book that tells you how to enter our sanctuary. And you can literally come into our online sanctuary where, we have speakers, but also if the speaker is taking questions, you can put up your hand and you can ask a question. You can type questions on the board. And,
This is
We
like
have
the Sunday morning services. You have speakers like
Well,
that?
but we're open all day Sunday. We're open Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday, all day Wednesday, and we're open Thursday night. So more than just a Sunday morning service. In fact, Gina Lake is one of the speakers in our sanctuary. She speaks on Wednesdays, just
nice.
before me.
Every week?
Pardon?
Every week?
Yeah, every week.
Yeah.
Every week. And then we
I
have
interviewed Gina years ago. She's a good friend.
Yeah, I love her too. I love her too.
Yeah.
And then we have different people that we invite to come for like a mini series. Like they wouldn't want to come every week like Gina does, but they might come for 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks in a row.
Who are some
For
people you have
example,
scheduled?
we have Martha Creek scheduled in January,
Interviewed her.
Suzanne Marie scheduled in February, Maria Felipe scheduled in March, and then I haven't gotten to April yet. I'll be working on that next.
Nice.
So, and then we have monthly satsangs on the third Sunday of every month. We invite somebody different for a one-time thing to interview. We had, I think it was Locke Kelly last month. I think you gave me his email address because I was having trouble reaching him. We have Kate Greaves this month. Next month we have Mary Reed. You know, so just
Sure.
and all these things. Also, the audios are on our website, so people can go and listen to the audios. But you can come into our sanctuary and participate live in these types of events. And then we also have a radio station, an internet broadcast that's on 24/7. So even when our sanctuary is open, the sanctuary is being broadcast.
How do you keep that full of content 24/7?
It's all a YouTube playlist, and I add YouTubes every morning.
I see.
So I go on. So like you can hear Buddha at the gas pump
So
there.
they just rotate through there different
It just-
contents
well,
that you add.
we always delete stuff off the top and add stuff at the bottom, so
I
it's
see.
always changing.
Cool.
And I keep around 400 to 500 things in it at a time, so that I don't have to be chasing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we just turn on that YouTube playlist, and it's playing through the radio. It has teachings, music, sometimes documentaries, sometimes humor.
That's great.
And you can get to that from our website too by just going to the sanctuary menu and then clicking on Listen Live. So there's and we have annual retreats.
Does it cost anything to belong to it?
It doesn't cost anything to belong. It's just like any other church. We
Voluntary.
survive donations.
Yeah.
And we do have paid staff. I do receive a salary. Jacqueline Eckert, our vice president, receives a salary. Ken Gibson, our sanctuary director, receives a salary, and Cheryl Kaplan, our assistant sanctuary director, receives a salary. And then, of course, there's expenses for different servers, different services that you use in that way. So the donations are helpful. It keeps us going. Without them, we would have to close.
Yeah.
But no, the only thing that we charge for, obviously, are the retreats because they cost money.
Physical on location.
Physical
yeah.
retreats. Yeah, and also the Minister Preparation Program, which is a 2-year program, and it's actually a very good, very helpful program to people. Everybody who goes through it grows spiritually. They see differently at the end of the program than they did at the beginning. And then you also are an ordained minister, which some people actually just refuse that at the end. They don't care about that. They just but if you want to be a minister at the end, you're an ordained minister at the end.
So you could
that-
actually marry people or something if you wanted to, right?
You can marry people. You can get into prisons and hospitals more easily. Yeah, there are different benefits to being a minister if someone wanted to be a minister. So yeah, the minister program and the physical retreats cost money, but everything else that we provide, if it's free, everything else that we provide is free. I started to say if it's free for us to do it, but it's not free for us to do
Right.
it because of the paid staff and the servers and all. So
Yeah.
But
That sounds
yeah.
pretty neat. It's a really cool enterprise.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of fun, and it just went through a major shift in that originally it was like 2 organizations came together and did this, and although both organizations are very sweet, they really wanted 2 different things. One organization was very, very focused on A Course in Miracles, and the other organization, which is Awakening Together, much more open.
Yeah.
And so we just recently kind of had this really nice, friendly split where the organization that's focused on A Course in Miracles is called ACIM Gather. They have their own Pal Talk room now, their own virtual room and their own radio and all of that. And then Awakening Together has their own. And that just felt really, really good to make that split. So it's kind of a fresh start for us. We even have open times in our schedules a little bit where we're still looking for some teachers like Gina Lake, some teachers to come in. So if anybody's hearing this and you're like, ooh, that's for me, be sure to email me. I think Rick will probably make the email address available.
Yeah, I'll put whatever you want on your Batgap page,
Yeah.
links to all these things you're talking about, and your contact info. And
But we're real
yeah,
excited to grow, and we welcome everyone who feels like they want to be a part of it.
that's great. And obviously, you can go through my 375 Batgap interviews and pick out people that you might want to have
Well,
participate and just reach out to them.
this is where we get a lot of the people for our our monthly songs, our mini series, and this is why I don't know if you've noticed, but I do send you a donation once a year, and this is why, because I use you to some degree, and if I use you, I should pay you. That's the way.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I subscribe to your email. Actually, I've been subscribing to that for years. And,
Okay.
Okay, great. So this has been wonderful. Is there anything else that you want to say before we wrap it up that we haven't said?
No, I think probably the thing that I would want to emphasize is I really do want to invite anybody who wants to join us in Awakening Together to join us. That's how something like that becomes richer, is when people come and they bring their own talents and their own insights and all of that. And it turns into something really very beautiful. So please check out awakening-together.org and join us. And even though I founded it and I'm a teacher there, it's not the type of thing where I'm the teacher there.
Right.
Everybody is invited. So.
And obviously, it's not any sort of binding commitment. You can check it out and try it for a couple weeks,
right.
and if you don't like it, then don't come
Then
back.
leave.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
A couple of questions came in. Let me just quickly scan them. My friend in London, they came in so quickly recently that he hasn't had a chance to review them, but let me just quickly check. Let's see. All right, this looks like one I could read. This is from Jenny in Portola Valley, California. Appreciating this interview much. Thanks, both of you, for all your helpful work. Much inspiration and resonant teaching, but I'm still stuck somewhere in habits, thought patterns that keep me in my smaller self. Don't know how I can be more willing and wanting, prayerful. But so far, while progress of some sorts feels constant, it's not setting me free from feeling stuck. Kind of an ambiguous Hail Mary, I know, but any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, what I guess the answer I want to say to that is I am starting something new in January, because I've observed that, this is true for a lot of people where they, maybe they've been on this path for a while, they've read all the books, they've been to the satsangs, and yet they just feel like there's not enough movement. Maybe there's been some, but they don't feel like there's enough movement. And, and I have walked that path, even though I am still awakening. I have walked that path of letting go of what causes us to suffer. And so in January, I'm going to start on Tuesday nights leading a group of anybody who wants to join, where I'm going to do my best to help people let go of what's causing them to suffer. And I can't tell you 100% exactly how I'm going to do that. It's going to be intuitive, but I'm going to work with people. And they can join us in the Awakening Together Sanctuary. It will start at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 5 p.m. Pacific, and it will begin on January 10th of 2017, and it will go for as long as it goes. So if somebody happens to watch this 2 years from now, it's possible that it will still be going on.
So you'll have other things going on if not.
Yeah.
One thing I would say to that person, somebody else asked me that recently out at the SAND conference. I was sitting having breakfast with some friends, and she was just feeling like, it's so wonderful to be here with all these people, but now I'm going home and I'm going to be out in the world and getting caught up in all the usual stuff, and how do I hang on to this, nice thing that gets enlivened when I'm in a group like this? And I just kind of said, based on my own experience, that if you have some sort of practice that works for you, that you can make routine, do it every day, once a day, twice a day, whatever the nature of the practice is, that will help to really anchor you and keep reinforcing, so that you just don't get totally caught up in things and forget about,
Well, that's the type of thing I'll be doing in this new group. We use the term homework, but it's not studying. I will be giving people things. Do this week, and then come back and tell me how that was for you. So it won't be just showing up for 2 hours a week and listening to Regina talk. There's going to be interactive discussion.
Yeah.
There are going to be assignments, because that's how I did it. I mean, I did it by doing something, in a very focused way, not only every day, but just all the time.
Yeah.
And I want to help people, the people who really want to heal. And I know not everyone really does. I'm very aware of that. And like I said, there's those mixed priorities.
Well, I think everybody wants to. They just may not realize that they want to, or they might mistake, other things as potential sources of healing and fulfillment, which actually are going to let them down. But,
exactly,
yeah.
I agree with it. They may need to taste some other things first, or at least see that those other things aren't gonna do it for them.
Yeah.
But people who really, 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 really want this, I can maybe point and help and give people some practices and and what some people tell me is they stick to the practices better if they're in a group that's doing it,
really
and they
helps.
have to come back every week and talk about it, right? So it's that kind of a collaborative, we're doing this together kind of thing.
Yeah, there's so many examples from various scriptures about the importance of a group. Yeah, Jesus said, what did he say? Wherever 2 or 3 or more of you are together,
Yes.
are gathered together in my name, there I am. And like the end of the 10th mandal of the Rig Veda has this whole thing about this assemblage of enlightened people and how significant that is, and assembly is significant in unity and so on. And so many spiritual teachers have said that the company of enlightened, or company of fellow seekers and people with that sort of orientation is such a powerful technique in and of itself for accelerating evolution. So really bears, and obviously you're doing it in a really neat online way that doesn't necessitate, so somebody living in northern Wyoming can participate with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also we do, for people who just absolutely can't make it during that time, it'll be recorded and posted too, so people in that way could be participating at their convenience. So yeah.
I really appreciate that. Some people, they complain a bit when they watch these interviews. They say, well, I get a little tired of hearing people just describe their experience of their awakening.
Yeah.
And even if they offer something to do, like come to my satsang and hear me describe my experience of my awakening, it's not quite as hands-on and practical as they would like. So
Yeah, no,
I really
this will
appreciate
be
the
very-
effort you're making.
Yeah, this is very practical. And remember that first, when I said that prayer on that Disney cruise, what came down over me, I mean, I said it, but it came to me to say it, was please make me useful for the rest of my life. Yep. So, somehow I'm still fulfilling that. So this is kind of my job, not until it's not anymore. I've actually had some feelings lately that it will be ending. And so this is one reason why I really feel to do into this and to bring as much people to this state that I'm at as possible, because when it ends for me, I think awakening together will continue. And so it needs to be left with other people who now know this joy, this happiness, this peace, and they can turn around and share with others.
Great. Well, thanks so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I've been speaking with Regina Dawn Akers, and I'll be putting a page up on batgap.com with description of everything we've been talking about and links to the things she wants us to link to, so you can follow up on all this. And as most of you watching know, this is an ongoing series. There's one every week, so if you go to batgap.com, you can sign up to get an email each time one is posted, and you'll be notified. You can subscribe on YouTube, and YouTube will notify you whenever I post one. There's an audio podcast if you prefer to listen in audio while commuting or something. The donate button I mentioned in the beginning, we rely upon people's support and appreciate that. And some other things, if you explore the menus, you'll find some useful little tools. For instance, there's a geographical thing where if you type in a particular city anywhere in the world, it'll show you in order of the proximity anyone I've interviewed who is doing something in those locations. So that's, I believe, under the resources menu. So anyway, check out the menus, and thanks for listening or watching, and we will see you next week. And thank you, Regina.
Thank you, Rick.